Many of you may have never heard the name Richard Allen, and yet among people who have shaped religion in America, he is someone of enormously outsized influence. Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist and writer, never met Richard Allen, but he deeply admired him. He once said that among the remarkable men whose names have found deserved place in American annals, there is not one who will be longer remembered or whose memory will be more sacredly cherished than the name and character of Richard Allen. The famed sociologist W.E. Du Bois, who was born some 37 years after Allen's death, once said that the church Allen founded was, quote, by long odds the vastest and most remarkable product of American Negro civilization. For these reasons and many more, I am perfectly comfortable saying the relationship of the black community in America to the church cannot be understood without looking to Richard Allen. So who was he? Well, Negro Richard, which was his first identifier, was born into slavery on February 14, 1760. His owner was a man named Benjamin Chew, who would go on to become an important jurist in Philadelphia, even rising to Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. When Richard was 7, Chew sold Richard's family to a neighbor in Delaware named Stokely Sturgis. Sturgis owned a farm that raised corn, wheat, rye, and flax. Richard developed skills as a laborer on that farm. He could not only do agricultural tasks, but also the work of a sawyer, a butcher, a mason, and a cartman. Those abilities made him valuable, and it may explain, at least in part, why, when Sturgis was struggling financially, he kept Richard, but sold Richard's mother and 3 of his siblings to cover some of his debts. In Richard Allen's memoir that was published 2 years after his death, Richard will talk about those early years not as something marked simply by the kinds of deprivations he endured when he was a slave, limited amounts of food, for instance, which is one of the reasons he tended his own garden at night. For him, the core issue was the uncertainty associated with the lack of control over his own fate. He said, "We thought that after our master's death, we were liable to be sold to the highest bidder, as Sturgis was much in debt, and thus my troubles were increased, and I was often brought to weep between the porch and the altar." Things changed for Richard when, around the age of 17, he heard an itinerant Methodist preacher. It stirred something in him. Last week, we talked about the First Great Awakening with its emotional appeals, which led to such moments of conversion. While this time frame in the late 1770s would have been after the height of that movement, many historians will call our attention to the fact that the work of revivals via itinerant ministers continued unabated, especially in more rural areas. In fact, this approach to the work of evangelism was central to the rise of Methodism in this country. You may not realize that at this time, Methodists did not have churches of their own, and thus relied heavily on these kinds of evangelical meetings to grow. In case you're wondering why that was the case, you may remember that the founder of Methodism was John Wesley, and John Wesley was an Anglican minister. To his mind, Methodism was a reform movement within the Church of England rather than a separate denomination. I would also tell you that while Wesley came to America with his brother Charles in 1735 to evangelize, he only spent 2 years on these shores before returning home to lead the revival movement in England, and Charles had returned even sooner due to illness. The Methodist movement then, in this early period, was directed from England, even as people in the Americas were following its premises. In revivals then, Methodist ministers were inviting people into a way of living that focused on Bible study and prayer and good works, like the Holy Club we talked about that Whitefield joined. It was meant to complement the work of the Church of England in its local parishes. Followers still considered themselves to be members of the communion of the Church of England. Another point that I hope you will recall is that the Wesleys were strongly, thoroughly opposed to slavery. So too was the Methodist movement that they built, and Wesley required preachers in the Methodist movement to advance the same. Thus, the gospel Richard would have heard was not only steeped in the emotive style of revival preachers, it was not only Arminian in terms of stressing the availability of salvation for all who believed, but it also would have emphasized that all were equal in the sight of God, regardless of race. After his conversion, Richard joined the Methodist Society, which again is how Methodism worked, by gathering local folks for encouragement, study, and accountability. And he became tireless in his efforts to evangelize others. His owner, Sturgis, was also moved by the events of this time, and one Methodist minister in particular, a man named Freeborn Garretson, was going to become important to the story. Now, Garretson was born in 1752 to a Maryland-based slaveholding family. He converted to Methodism in the early 1770s by the work of itinerant preachers and became a pupil of Francis Asbury, one of the preachers John Wesley selected to go and work in America. Asbury, in fact, approved Garretson to become an itinerant preacher in 1776. Right about that same time, Garretson inherited his father's holdings and immediately set about to start freeing his slaves. His views on slavery got him into trouble more than once, but they were going to become life-changing for Richard. Garretson, you see, came into the Sturgis orbit and was instrumental in getting Sturgis to free his slaves, with a catch. Sturgis could not afford to let Richard go outright, but he did allow him to work for his own freedom and for that of his brother. The price he had to earn was $2,000 in continental currency over a 5-year period. That's between $50,000 and $75,000 in today's dollars. Richard labored intently in all kinds of jobs to make it possible, cutting wood, handling support services for the Continental Army, and of course preaching the gospel. He managed to purchase his freedom, and he took the last name Allen to move into that new life, although the reasons for that choice were something he never explained. One of the interesting facts I should mention is that Richard Allen usually kept his letter of reference from Sturgis and a document of manumission on his person when he traveled, because being able to prove one was free was the reality for persons of color in the colonies. That practice was rooted in his own experience of once being put into prison when a slave hunter accused him of being a runaway slave, and it was only via his connections in the white community that he managed to extricate himself. In 1786, Allen settled in Philadelphia. It was a good choice for a home because the city had abolished slavery in 1780, and a growing number of free blacks were settling there. To earn his living, he took on as much trade work as he could, handling tasks like whitewashing and shoemaking and selling dry goods. He was industrious, to say the least, and we should realize that was necessary because it wasn't easy for a black man to find or to make work. His efforts, however, brought him into contact with some important people. In 1789, for instance, he founded a chimney sweeping business, and then President George Washington was a client. You may recall from your history lessons that Washington was living in Philadelphia during his second term. In these years, Allen managed not only to buy a home, but he also acquired some properties where he could earn rental income. In short, he was rising up in prominence. It was, however, his faith that defined his life, and once in the city, he started preaching at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, I need to give you a quick aside for a little of the history of that church, and in the process, a bit more Methodist denominational background. St. George's is, still today, the oldest house of Methodist worship in continuous use in America. In 1767, Captain Thomas Webb organized a Methodist society in Philadelphia. 2 years later, that society bought St. George's Church, which had been built in 1763 as a Dutch Reformed church, but had to be auctioned off when the congregation didn't have enough money to complete the structure. To support and nurture Methodism in the colonies, John Wesley had sent 2 lay preachers, Richard Boardman and Joseph Pilmore, from England in 1769. Fillmore's first speech was at St. George's, at the Methodist Society there on his arrival, and he talked about the principles of Methodism and held his first prayer meeting in that building. 2 years later, Richard Wright and Francis Asbury came at Wesley's behest because of the success of what was unfolding in the colonies. So the first conference of Methodist preachers in the colony was held in Philadelphia at St. George's just 4 years later in 1773. The 10 ministers who came to that conference affirmed Wesley's leadership. But as I have indicated earlier, and given that we are still 3 years prior to the Revolution at that point, they had to define their relationship to the Church of England. And at that 1773 meeting, they agreed that they would not administer the sacraments since they were still lay people. Instead, Methodists would receive sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper at a local Anglican parish. That's why we get Methodist Episcopal Church. Now that arrangement might sound odd now, but again, it was what Wesley wanted at the outset. I won't go into detail this morning, but after independence, when many Anglican ministers went home, Methodists needed to have their own ministers. So if we skip ahead to December 1784, Methodists gathered at the so-called Christmas Conference in Baltimore and organized themselves as the Methodist Episcopal Church in America and began to ordain their own. That group at the Christmas Conference, by the way, included 2 black men, Harry Hosier, a slave born in North Carolina who was close to Francis Asbury and would become known in the Second Great Awakening as one of the greatest orators alive, and, you guessed it, Richard Allen. But equality in the eyes of God did not always mean fairness in the world. They were permitted to come to that conference, but they couldn't vote in it. Now, I don't want to lose the story of Richard Allen, so I need to return us back to when he first arrived in Philadelphia at 1786. By that point, he was a seasoned preacher. And even though he was asked to preach at St. George's, he did so at the 5 a.m. slot in the service for then a small number of black congregants. That service literally grew into a problem. So many black folks started to show up that the leadership of the church got worried. I want to say at the outset of this next section that you can read lots of different accounts of the order of the events I'm going to describe, but we have to be careful. Many of them have been made into a neat and convenient narrative, like they're being filmed into a good movie, but they likely erase the complexity of what actually unfolded. Even more, the historical records are sketchy and sometimes don't fit together neatly. So here's where I think we begin. St. George's Church, in many ways, was a microcosm of larger societal issues with race in Philadelphia. While no slaves were permitted in the city, that fact did not mean that people were all ready to embrace equality between the races. Nor did it mean that newly free blacks were prepared to succeed in that environment. These interconnected issues concerned men like Allen and his friend and fellow congregant Absalom Jones. Allen and Jones and some other leading black men saw that the majority of Philadelphia's black community was, not surprisingly, illiterate. They also worried they didn't go to church, and they thought that these circumstances would limit black advancement and perpetuate misunderstandings around blacks among white people. So these men got together to form a non-denominational but still religious society to promote literacy and religion among free blacks in the city. It was called the Free African Society. Allen had a deep belief that piety produced industriousness because it promoted discipline and had an eye towards getting out and being of service in the world. Still, in order to succeed and build up the black community, they knew that this society would also have to meet the needs of the people they wanted as their members. So this is how it worked. To join, you paid monthly dues and agreed to be temperate and not to engage in disorderly behavior, like drinking or gambling. In return, you got benefits from the funds collected, like payments for burials of members, aid for widows and children of the deceased, help in finding apprenticeships for young people to learn a trade, or funding for schooling if needed. The work of this society also offered support to families in times of unemployment or illness. Overall, what you should see was that it served as a way of building community and helping people through their harder moments when there was no social safety net to catch them. And it was independent of any white organization or supervision. It's going to be one of the first of many organizations like that in the country. But it also, you should notice, was doing the work that happened via many churches, but not for their black membership. That's another sign of the inequality in a community that was supposed to be committed to all people as children of God. But I don't want to lose the fact that another of the major goals that the leaders of this organization wanted to achieve was to change the narrative among white people that black people were lazy, couldn't abide by the rules of civilized society, and could not be successful. These ideas were often given as a justification for slavery, and Allen and Jones wanted it to be clear that this impression of black people was untrue. One of the more interesting things that the record reveals was that the Free African Society also encouraged black people not to go down that road by saying that such behaviors showed a lack of respect for other blacks who were still enslaved. Now, this group started out meeting in Richard Allen's house, but it quickly grew so large it had to move. And, as it was designed to be, it was a feeder into the church, including into St. George's. Yet that aspect meant the men were increasingly facing tension in places of worship because of the growth of the black population. St. George's actually had to build a balcony to accommodate its growth, and that addition was supported by all of the congregation who worked together to raise the money. But here came another problem. In a tussle over who could sit where during prayer, Absalom Jones and another black congregant were accosted by ushers who sought to relocate them physically. In response, Allen led a number of other black attendees in a walkout. It was, to use the parlance of our time, a kind of Rosa Parks moment for the late 18th century. The departing blacks would eventually divide into different congregations. Absalom Jones formed a black Episcopal meeting, which accepted oversight by that church's white bishop. And I should mention that Jones would go on to become the first black Episcopal priest in this country in 1802. But Richard Allen wanted something different. He envisioned an autonomous black church that adhered to Methodist theology and practice, because he thought the Methodist ways were better suited to the black experience. But he also didn't want to have whites in charge. It took a while to get there. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Robert Ralston, a local philanthropist who might be familiar to Presbyterians as the first president of the Board of Education of the Presbyterian Church, were the first to lend financial backing to Richard Allen. George Washington also kicked in some money. And a lot was selected on the corner of 6th and Lombard Streets and was purchased by Allen. It is still the longest continuously owned piece of property by black people in the United States. He would eventually buy a blacksmith shop and have it hauled over to the property, and he retrofitted it to serve as a meeting place. But then Mother Nature interfered. There was some delay in progress when a horrible epidemic of yellow fever came to the city in 1793, and what happened then is also important. People who could afford to leave the city and had someplace to go, mostly white wealthy folks, left. That should sound familiar to all of us through COVID. But this disease would still kill nearly 1/10 of Philadelphia's population, many of them poor. The white flight tripled the city's proportion of blacks, and Mayor Clarkston turned to Allen and Jones to recruit blacks to help do necessary work, like nursing, street cleaning, being pallbearers, and grave diggers. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was one of Allen's friends, encouraged that effort because he thought, wrongly and clearly as the result of the racialized medicine of that era, that blacks were less susceptible to yellow fever. Rush also, however, was an abolitionist, and he thought that the epidemic could be a turning point in race relations by helping whites see blacks willing to sacrifice to help their neighbors. Allen and Jones shared that view. Well, as you might imagine, it didn't quite turn out that way. Toward the end of the epidemic, problems between the white and black communities were fanned by people like a journalist named Matthew Carey. He was publishing reports charging blacks with extorting from the sick for their services and exploiting the crisis to steal from white homes. I should add that Carey was doing this even though he fled the city, although he was on the mayor's commission to shape response to the disease. Allen and Jones responded to these charges with a forceful pamphlet entitled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia. It was the first pamphlet written by blacks in this country to receive a federal copyright. And it was an important document of black history because it put the black experience of an event at the center of the story and fought back against a version of events that was harmful to the black community. That is, they took control of the story. Allen and Jones made it clear that 2/3 of the caregivers in the city during the epidemic were black, and what wages they earned were a mixed bag. They acknowledged that sometimes those wages were set by the laws of supply and demand, but they reminded folks that many blacks were volunteers and that organizations like the Free African Society also paid for this work from their own pockets and even accumulated debt to do things like bury many who never paid for their services at all. Jones and Allen were also unequivocal in documenting that blacks died from yellow fever during the epidemic, noting the fourfold increase in the number of black burials in 1793 compared to 1792, and asking pointedly, was this to a great degree the effects of the services of the unjustly vilified people? They did not take the slings and arrows of the more powerful in society without fighting back. By 1794 then, with the epidemic past and the community recovering, Allen was finally back to getting his church open, and he welcomed congregants to what became known as Mother Bethel Church. It was the first African Methodist Episcopal church in this country. It only had 40 charter members, because again, many of the blacks followed Jones into the Episcopal Church. And initially, Allen had to rely on traveling white Methodist pastors to administer communion, at least until 1799, when he was officially ordained by Francis Asbury, the first black man to inhabit such a role within Methodism. Mother Bethel was the fastest growing Methodist congregation in the city. By 1805, a larger building and additional land were needed, and the church trustees purchased 2 adjoining lots from Richard Allen on the church's north side and 2 on the south side, and put up a rough cast block structure. But things were not smooth sailing because St. George's decided they wanted control of it. They sought to require payment in exchange for sending their clergy to preach, and they also wanted to have Bethel's land transferred into the Methodist Conference. By 1815, things were really at a fever pitch. White Methodist elders were repeatedly trying to force their way into the Bethel pulpit to show legal possession, and they were always denied, including by congregants who would sit themselves in the aisles to block access. It's a nonviolent resistance at its best. Things landed in the courts, and white groups eventually won the right to sell the building and its land. Richard Allen was furious, and so he set his mind to buy his own land and his own building and raised $10,125 to do so, which would be pushing $250,000 today. Now, the white folks didn't give up, but by 1816, Allen prevailed all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and he and his trustees got their rights to everything upheld. Free at last, Allen then set to gathering between 10 and 15 other black churches on the eastern seaboard together to start his own denominational conference, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, as we know it today. He was elected its first bishop. This first solely black denomination was free from the supervision of whites, and it multiplied in terms of members and geography. Today it has 2.5 to 3.5 million members worldwide, with around 7,000 congregations across 20 Episcopal districts. And just as a footnote, I will add it is distinct from the slightly smaller AME Zion churches, which trace back to a group emerging in New York City in the same era, but with their own distinct history. I could add that Allen did many other things in addition to his ministry, because for him, ministry was always connected to life. For instance, he worked with his family from 1797 until his death to operate an underground railroad station. Along with Absalom Jones, he petitioned Congress for the abolition of the slave trade and called for African American citizenship and equality, causes that would not be realized until the passage of the 14th Amendment over 60 years later. He worked to open schools for African Americans. Allen offered Mother Bethel as the host for the first ever national meeting of African American leaders known as the Colored Convention. This meeting became a precursor to later civil rights organizations like the NAACP. Those actions are not to say that Allen did not get discouraged by America or sometimes did not struggle with the many limitations of this country. For instance, he would be open at different points in time to some of the colonization movements for blacks to find a new home, whether it be in Sierra Leone, Haiti, or Canada, which is one of the reasons why the Colored Convention was convening in 1830. Allen also understood that Black Americans were being impeded in efforts to make progress, and that the efforts to overcome both the reality and legacy of slavery were slow, and frequently success felt elusive. He also, however, would be adamantly opposed to white efforts to force blacks out of this country or to sponsor black colonies. If it was going to happen, he thought it had to be a black initiative. But he did everything in his power to encourage people to keep fighting for justice, especially because he was reluctant to abandon those blacks who were not yet free from slavery. In some of his most famous words, he said, "The land which we have watered with our tears and our blood is now our mother country, and we are well satisfied to stay where wisdom abounds and the gospel is free." To bring us to a close, I will let Allen's biographer, Richard Newman, professor of history at the Rochester Institute of Technology, sum up some of the most salient points about Richard Allen. Newman writes, "As the most prominent black preacher of his era, he helped inaugurate a moral critique of slavery and slaveholding that shaped abolitionism for years to come. As one of the first black pamphleteers, he pushed not only for slavery's demise, but also for black equality. As a black institution builder, he spurred the creation of autonomous organizations and churches that nurtured African American struggles for justice throughout the 19th century. As a sometimes doubter of American racial equality, he participated in black immigration to Haiti. And as a leader of the first National Black Convention, he defined continent-wide protest tactics and strategies for a new generation of activists. All in all, then, Richard Allen was a defining force in shaping black religious experience and its associated activism in this country. In a week where we have celebrated the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., we should certainly know Richard Allen, who helped pave Dr. King's way.